So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for being with us today. We've got a large crowd. Hopefully we'll get some answers for you. I know you probably, if you've been listening, because for some of you, this is probably your second time seeing me this week with human trafficking. But today we're going, I am one of your presenters. I am Monica Brewer. I work for the Texas Education Agency, and I am the statewide coordinator for gifted and talented education. And then I also do child abuse prevention and awareness, specifically working on human trafficking. And so that is my contact information. And then my partner today is Todd. Todd, if you would like to introduce yourself, and he is with the Office of the Governor. Jimmy, there.
Good to be with y'all this morning and see all of you. My name's Todd Ladiolis. I'm the Prevention and Policy Administrator on Governor Abbott's Child Sex Trafficking team, and we've been partnering a lot with TEA and other agencies to support schools as they address child abuse and trafficking. And I'll give a little bit more background and context on our team during the presentation. It's good to be here.
And so our topic for today is our requirements and legislation on human trafficking. And so just kind of give you a little background and some context of the work. Really looking at our partnering agencies, how we have been collaborating to support schools and school districts and to us in addressing child abuse and human trafficking. And so as you will see on our slide, one, Texas Education Agency, and then thinking Region 14 with their Title IV with their School Safety Center initiative with Rod and Nancy, and their intern this year is Amber. And so they've been doing a lot of great work on making sure that we are on the right front and building out some of those supports as we go into this. Another partner is Region 12 with Heather Willer and Jennifer Janik. And their work there, and really, if you remember from last year, looking at the asset mapping and building out how do you connect all the dots for your districts as they go into this. TASB with our Texas Association of School Boards, really making sure that with the policy and their training components on human trafficking and child abuse. Texas Schools Safety Center. Then our Children's Advocacy Centers of Texas, really working with districts and schools, really looking at the whole components of really how can they support a kid from prevention awareness to actually getting them acclimated to life after being being a victim to trafficking. And then our Department of Family and Protective Services, really working with them with the reporting process, and then also the supports of our students as they are in that system and into how we replace them out there. Was there someone, or was just make sure. Then we have Crime Stoppers of Houston, who is a part of our process. And with Crime Stoppers, they're really looking at, as I said, they're centralized in Houston, but they are all across the state. And if you call into that number, you can reach out. It will direct to your own locale. And then once again, our Office of the Texas Governor with our child sex trafficking team, and with Todd and his partner and work in this work, Debbie Scholler, really looking at how can we support kids, how can we build out our systems across the state, working with all those other partners that are coming into your buildings, finding out those contacts, providing some grant services. So really thinking about the full work. And so that leads it to, I want to say, this is your slide, Todd.
Yeah, so Monica and I are going to sort of tag team the presentation today. I'm going to give a little bit more basic background, and then we'll move into some sort of legislative updates from the most recent session, and then just a refresher near the end of some requirements for districts and schools, and just sort of reminders about some of those and how to fulfill them. But as I mentioned, I work in the governor's office on the child sex trafficking team, and our team was actually created by legislation. So appropriate topic back around 2015 in the 84th session. So if you're not familiar, we'll talk about this more in a bit, but there is a statewide human trafficking task force. That's a multidisciplinary group that's been around since 2009. It's chaired by the Office of the Attorney General. The first person to chair that task force was Greg Abbott when he was Attorney General. And that group does a lot of things, but they make legislative recommendations back to the state legislature. So going into that session in 2015, one of the recommendations was to have a single statewide team focused on the issue of child sex trafficking, to really look at what are the gaps, how are children identified, what are the appropriate services available for them, and really coordinate a holistic response. And around that same time, Greg Abbott left the AG's office and ran for governor. So he was governor during that session when that was proposed, and the legislature said, yes, we agree, this is a good idea. And they said, you seem to like this idea, so we're going to put it in your office. So we exist in statute and the government code. And what you see here is actually just a visual representation of different responsibilities of our team that are laid out in the code. It's quite comprehensive. So everything from the front end of protecting children from being exploited and trafficked in the first place, supporting prevention efforts to stop this from happening, improving identification of victims around the state, and once those are identified, recovering them and supporting their healing in the long term. And so the statute actually has a pretty bold charge of facilitating advocacy, case management, and long-term rehabilitation needs for survivors that are identified. And finally, we're also charged with helping to support efforts to bring justice and train law enforcement and support prosecutors. And so I would say, just to be honest with you, the bulk of our work in these first 5 years has really been heavily focused on screening high-risk youth, identifying potential victims, and getting them the services and the help that they need. That has been the urgent ask from our legislature and our boss. Doing that work for 5 years, we've really come up with a system to facilitate care, to partner with children's advocacy centers, to dispatch advocates to these youth. And now that we're getting that under our belt, we're moving more into those other ends of the spectrum. And I know that schools have a big role to play, especially in that protection space, and preventing this from happening in the first place. So that's our team. Next slide, I just wanted to give a baseline. I'm sure many of you have been in trafficking presentations before. This is probably not your first time talking about child abuse and trafficking. You're probably particularly familiar with child abuse at large, but I just wanted to provide a real basic definition of trafficking. And so what you see on the screen here is just my sort of layman's terms that reflects both federal and state law around trafficking. And that is that human trafficking happens when there's either labor or commercial sex that's been obtained through force, fraud, or coercion. So it could be labor trafficking, could be sex trafficking. Just keep in mind, commercial sex just means something of value was exchanged for that sexual activity. We tend to think of prostitution and money being exchanged, but a lot of things have value and could fall under the code. So drugs, for example, have value. Food has value. Shelter has value. So anytime those things are being exchanged for that sexual act, if there's force, fraud, or coercion, that could be sex trafficking under the statute. The big, major, important caveat in terms of protecting children is that force, fraud, and coercion don't have to be shown for sex trafficking of children. So if somebody is under the age of 18 and they're engaged in commercial sexual activity, they are a victim under the law. It doesn't matter if they appear to be consenting. It doesn't matter if they said, yes, I want my image on this website, set up dates with these people. I can do this. I'm grown. I'm supporting my family. It doesn't matter. The law says that they're a victim. They cannot consent to their own sexual exploitation. And one more piece of just context and background on the next slide. is really a reminder that trafficking is a form of child abuse under the family code. And so this has been the case in Texas actually since 2011. The family code gives a long list of things that can be considered child abuse. So I've just pulled the two relevant subsections of that abuse definition. I won't go through it there, but just believe me when I say what all this text tells you is that if a child has been compelled or encouraged to engage in commercial sexual conduct, or if they're being trafficked, that is child abuse. We won't go super into the weeds on this today. I know all of you are familiar with DSPS, investigations of abuse and neglect, but one thing to just be aware of and keep in mind is that DSPS jurisdiction comes into play whenever a child has been abused by their caregiver or guardian. So this is always abuse, regardless of who does it, and it needs to be reported. But just keep in mind that DSPS is not likely to investigate and take custody of that child unless the person who's either trafficking them or allowing knows about the trafficking to happen is a family member, caregiver, person responsible for their custody and control. If it's not their jurisdiction, they'll do an information and referral to law enforcement. We can talk about some of that later with mandatory reporting, but that is a confusing thing for some people. So I did just want to highlight that for you all. Okay, moving on, let's get into some of the legislative updates from the most recent legislative sessions. I will say, that the 87th session was unique and historic in a lot of ways. Going into session, there were a lot of issues to address, right? And our lawmakers only meet every other year, odd numbered years for about half the year. So there's always a lot to do. But going into the 87th session in January, we had COVID, obviously, to be responding to, a lot of criminal justice reform calls being made. Very early on in session, we had snowvid, snowpocalypse, grid issues that had to be addressed during session. And, I will say, because of those reasons, a lot of people were not expecting a ton of energy around abuse and trafficking. There were so many other things going on. And I was surprised to see that there actually was quite a bit around trafficking. We're only going to talk really today about those issues that may affect you in schools. But I do have some resources, handouts available on our website if you're interested in sort of learning more about other trafficking issues that don't affect schools. But as we talk about legislative overviews, I wanted to highlight kind of how we got to where we are in 2021. So here's just a very basic timeline of things that had happened in prior sessions with respect to schools. So in 2009, we had Jenna's Law, as you all know, that addressed district policy around abuse of children, and that had to include certain things like parent, student, and teacher awareness around sexual abuse. In 2011, the legislature actually implemented annual training requirements for school personnel. They also added prevention as something that had to be addressed in policy requirements. And as you recall, I already mentioned that was the year that child abuse was defined and expanded to include trafficking. And honestly, I think that kind of went under the radar for a lot of people. They were so focused on child abuse that many missed the fact that that included trafficking. In 2013, we saw some updates to that training requirement. The commissioner had to release a training schedule to ensure that school employees were receiving training. Many of you may remember a big grant in partnership with Darkness to Light and the Stewards of Children training that helped with a lot of that child sexual abuse, mandatory recognition and reporting training. And again, in theory, hopefully trafficking was part of that as a form of child abuse, but I think for many, it hadn't really come into the limelight yet. There also was a curriculum created by the statewide task force. They were directed to do that by statute. That was the Rise to the Challenge curriculum some of you may have seen, but it wasn't mandatory at that point to take any task force curriculum. That was also the first time we had child abuse posters that were mandatory in schools. We'll talk about those later. Moving on past that, 2015 was the next session. Again, every other year, there were just some updates to policy language and mandatory reporting, and highlighting the fact that, yes, trafficking is part of the policies in your child abuse policy for a district. Fast forward actually a couple sessions, because not a whole lot happened in 2017, but in 2019 we saw some additional updates in the 86th session that again clarified that trafficking has to be included in district policies and trainings. There actually was a new training requirement for school board members and for superintendents on child abuse and trafficking. And we saw some clarification around prevention education. So around the same time, TEA, through their administrative rules, which basically give additional life and clarification around existing requirements, those administrative rules were updated around child abuse and neglect, and they provided further clarification on how trafficking is addressed in district policy, as well as that prevention component. There was a very vague line basically in the education code that says districts have to provide anti-victimization programming for students, and TEA clarified in rule that what that means, what the legislature intended, was age-appropriate, research-based education to prevent abuse and trafficking. So that's sort of a long background, but just to kind of show things weren't new in the 87th, that is kind of the framework that got us to this point. So going into the 87th session, on the next slide, you'll see some recommendations from the Human Trafficking Task Force. So as I mentioned, this is a multidisciplinary group that is chaired by the Attorney General's office, and one of their responsibilities in statute is to make legislative recommendations. It is a large group, and so what is really impressive is that that group does not actually include a recommendation in its report unless it has unanimous approval from all of the members of that task force. So if I were to give you the list of everything that task force members proposed as a recommendation, it would be much longer, but the only ones that actually get pitched, so to speak, to the legislature are those that have that unanimous support of the entire task force. We're not going to go into detail into all of these recommendations just because they don't all impact the education sector, but I wanted you to know what they are. They basically fall into three basic categories. The first is just statutory cleanup, and that's kind of fixing errors that we found in the code that really weren't supposed to be there. So just as an example, that first bullet there is extending the definition of coercion. We all know, I just told you, that you don't need force, fraud, or coercion for child sex trafficking, but you do need it for child labor trafficking, adult labor trafficking, or adult sex trafficking. And I think unintentionally, the definition of coercion for trafficking before the session only applied to adult sex trafficking, even though that's an element of labor trafficking. So that's an example of a cleanup, that when the code refers to coercion, it refers to all forms of trafficking and not just sex trafficking. The second bucket of recommendations had to do with investigative and prosecutorial tools that are available to hold offenders accountable. The one that probably got the most attention in the media is the second bullet there, which has to do with redefining prostitution. And so under that recommendation, buyers of commercial sex are now classified under their own statute, which wasn't the case before. They were always addressed in the broader prostitution statute, but now solicitation is its own separate offense. And attempting to purchase an adult is now a state jail felony on the first offense. I believe we're the first state in the country to actually make that a felony on the first offense. Basically, any other state, and in Texas prior to the session, it was a misdemeanor offense to attempt to purchase sex from an adult. Again, for our purposes, working with children, it was already a second-degree felony, sex offender registrable offense to attempt to purchase from a child, but the legislature wanted to take an even stronger approach to demand, even if the potential victim is an adult. And finally, the last category of recommendations from the task force had to do with protecting victims. And so you can see the one crossed through there. That was actually the only recommendation from the task force that didn't ultimately become law during this session. Everything else passed and was signed by the governor But the two pieces there for protecting victims had to do with increasing protections at RTCs. It's now criminal trespass to be at a RTC without that permission. It's also, you could face enhanced penalties for trying to recruit vulnerable children out of residential treatment centers and shelters for the purposes of trafficking. We know that those youth are particularly vulnerable. And then the other component had to deal with, it says SOBs there, but that's my shorthand for sexually oriented businesses. And so these establishments previously could hire individuals 18 and up, but the age for employment is now 21. So there was a lot of testimony from survivors and others that said those, even though they're not technically children, those young adults, 18 to 20, are highly susceptible to abuse and exploitation in these sexually oriented businesses. And so that age now is actually 21, and those clubs can face criminal penalties, civil penalties, and actually revocation of their alcoholic and beverage permits if they were to violate and have those minors on the premises there. That's just an overview of things that happened as a result of the task force. We're going to now move into talking about some things that have to deal with schools or kind of in close proximity to schools. So what this slide shows you is, again, a visual representation of Texas statutes addressing some component of mandatory training or awareness activity. And so this is actually representative prior to the most recent session. So you can see there in the middle, there were already statutes that addressed school level training and awareness for students and parents and district policy, school boards and superintendents, as I mentioned, and educators themselves. And I wanted to show this broader slide to show that you're not in this alone. As you can see, there are many other sectors that also have legislation addressing their training and awareness around trafficking. One of the other ones that was more recent is the last column there, and it's a little misleading that it's only one box, healthcare practitioners, because that box is so much larger than you might anticipate. So many categories of healthcare professionals that fall into that box that now have rulemaking and requirements around training. For example, my wife is a pharmacist, and I remember one day she was like, I just got this email that I have to take a human trafficking training. Do you know what this is about? And can you give me the training? I'm like, no, there's a whole, you have to go through an approved training for that. But physical therapists, clinical social workers, so many that are getting that training as a result of that. As we advance, there should be a couple of new boxes that pop up because these are new trainings as a result of this most recent legislative session. And those two new categories are hotel employees. So beginning in January, any hotel that has, I believe, 10 or more rooms is going to have to provide human trafficking training to employees, recognizing, especially with sex trafficking, that these establishments are utilized to host these victims. And so we want hotels to be on the lookout for that. And the other category that popped up there is driver's education. So there actually was a requirement that driver's education courses start to incorporate human trafficking prevention awareness materials in those courses. On the next slide, again, this is not specific to schools, but impacts a lot of places that you go and may recognize. So prior to this session, all of those boxes that are in sort of the darker tone, the top two rows, those are all locations that previously were legislatively mandated to have some sort of signage about human trafficking. And those signs typically said something to the effect of, if you or someone you know may be a victim of human trafficking, here's the number to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And so these were really targeted towards high-risk locations. Sexually oriented businesses have to have them in the restrooms. Transportation hubs, if you go to a travel information center, they're in the restrooms and travel information centers across the state. Emergency rooms have to have these signs. Bars across the state have to have these signs. You may have seen them in your hair salon or nail salon, signage about human trafficking. What these two new laws did during legislative session is they one, expanded the number of places that have to have these signs. So those at the bottom now are new locations, tattoo studios, state parks, that you may start seeing some of this signage. The second thing that it did is it updated the content of those signs. And so previously it just said, here's a number to the national hotline if you need to get help or access to services. It didn't have information about reporting potential traffickers and exploiters. And so now all of these signs are going to have sort of two pieces of language. One is going to say, if you recognize suspicious activity, if you have a report of trafficking that you would like to make, here's the number to DPS, to our statewide suspicious activity reporting system through iWatch, where you can report that suspicious behavior. And it will continue to have that language around, if you need confidential help accessing services and support, here's the number to the national hotline that can support you with accessing those services. On the next slide is an interesting piece of legislation that does impact schools directly. So this actually passed under two different bills. One was Senate Bill 1831 by Senator Taylor, just south of Houston. The other was House Bill 1540 by Synfronia Thompson in the Houston area. And 1540 actually was the very large omnibus bill that had almost all of the Human Trafficking Task Force recommendations. So along the way, a few additional things got added to that bill, including this no trafficking zone language. Basically, what this bill does is it creates a new type of safety zone around schools. And so many of you may be familiar with similar concepts like child safety zones or drug-free zones or gun-free zones, that sort of thing. What this does is create a similar concept called no trafficking zones around schools. And so in a no trafficking zone, basically, if you commit certain offenses, you can see there, human trafficking is the main one. If you were to commit a trafficking related offense in a no trafficking zone, you would be subject to enhanced penalties because you're in that zone. One of the things I wanted to point out was just something that happened by virtue of how the legislature works and how bills are passed. They clearly intended, when they passed these no trafficking zones, to include buyers and solicitation of prostitution if you were trying to purchase sex within this perimeter. But because I mentioned earlier that they redefined prostitution and moved that to a new section, that's actually not part of the legislation currently. So even though that was the intent, I think we'll see next session probably somebody revisit and say, we want buyers included in this as well if you're trying to purchase within a school perimeter. Interestingly, actually, online solicitation is part of this, which is sort of unique because it's, online and not in person. You don't have to be in that school perimeter, but what the law basically says is if a potential defendant is trying to solicit a minor online during school hours, and they know or should have known that that minor should be in school during those hours, they could also face enhancement. So that is, to me, a very interesting approach, and we'll see how that plays out. This does require some rulemaking. Monica, I don't know if you want to mention anything around implementation of this bill, if people are wondering, am I supposed to have a sign up right now? Because it does require schools to post warning signs indicating that it's a no trafficking zone.
Definitely. So yes, right now we are in the early stages of rulemaking on these signs. So no, you do not have to have a sign posted at your campus at this time. So we will be developing those. They will be coming out. The rules will be coming out probably about March of the 2020 in 2022. And then for you to do public comment, and then we'll go from there with actually probably having the digital version, your soft copy, however you like to call it, available in probably June, July for you to prepare and develop. This is one of those few things, as you know, as is a requirement, but it's an unfunded requirement. So we can provide the actual language and the signage and the design of the signage, but we cannot actually probably print at this time, unless there's other funds come up available for those signs. But we will provide the guidance on the distances from your building doors, where to post, and all of that will be part of that that public comment, all of that rulemaking. So really think about, if you got questions, feel free to send those in. As we go through this, we'll show at the end our email, so that if you got questions, you got wonderings beyond, what is feasible to help with that guidance, we will truly appreciate it. So thank you.
Yeah, and so I have heard some confusion from schools thinking that this is a sign that is like student facing, like the child abuse signs that you're used to posting in hallways, but this is more like a warning sign outside the school, similar to when you approach a property and see that sign telling you this is a gun-free zone, for example. It's more that sort of sign. And as Monica mentioned, the bill did say that TEA would provide signs to schools if they got an appropriation to do so, but they did not get that appropriation, which is not surprising considering how many schools there are around the state. I would have been surprised to see that. On the next slide, I wanted to mention another component that is school facing, and Monica is going to help me with this because she has some updated language from our State Association of School Boards to help provide clarity around this. But I wanted to give a little bit of context before I give it over to Monica. You can see the odd numbering there, 87.2. That's because this was actually not during the regular 87th session. As you may be aware, the governor has the authority and ability to convene special sessions after a regular session in order to accomplish specific business that wasn't accomplished during the regular session. So unlike regular session, when lawmakers can file bills on whatever topic they want, during a special session, they can only file and consider legislation that is relevant to the call of the governor, to things that are on that list of things to be considered. And so I just wanted to be transparent and open about where this initially sort of came from. And that's during the 87th regular session, there was a bill that was filed and that actually passed both chambers in some form that dealt specifically with dating violence and family violence policies in schools. And so there have been requirements around those policies for some time, but it basically beefed up what's contained around dating and family violence and required student prevention education at certain grade levels around those topics of dating violence and family violence. When that bill made it to the governor, he actually vetoed it because there were a lot of concerns, particularly from parental rights groups, because there was no provision in the bill addressing a parent's ability to be notified about that type of education, to be able to see what that curriculum was, and even potentially to opt out of that education as they have the ability with certain other types of instruction and curriculum. So the governor said, I appreciate the spirit of this bill, and even though it's not related to most of the issues on special session, I'm going to add this reconsideration if you incorporate that parental notification and opt out. So legislature revisited it in the first special session. It didn't quite make it anywhere. There were some other things going on during special session, and the governor included it again for consideration during the second special legislative session. And so that's how we got to this bill. I can't give background and context because I don't know more, but somewhere along the way that bill grew broader than it was during the regular session. It not only includes dating violence, family violence, but as you'll see here, it now covers child abuse and trafficking as well, which was not an original component of that legislation. And also their approach to approving and authorizing that curriculum changed pretty significantly from the regular session. So basically, the bill lays out a process by which the school board will convene the SHAC, the School Health Advisory Council, to review whatever content is going to be used as part of this prevention education requirement. Interestingly, those recommendations can't conflict with the TEKS, which we can talk about a little bit later, but the new health TEKS coming out next school year also address some of these same issues. And finally, the last bullet, the one that is perhaps the most different from what was filed last session. While the governor asked for parental notification and opt-out, the legislature actually went even further in terms of those protections for parents, and now require written consent. So more of an opt-in than an opt-out, but that is what the members chose to do when reconsidering this. And so there is a lot probably that your districts are going to have to be processing and figuring out whether materials and content that you have related to these issues are even subject to this requirement, whether they rise to the level of curriculum to have to be included in this procedure. But I do know that there has been some additional guidance that came out from TASB and others, and more guidance that is likely forthcoming as TEA processes how this relates to health teaks and other things. So I wanted to give Monica a chance if you wanted to provide any other thoughts on sort of what's coming, what to expect, and other guidance around this bill.
Thanks, Todd. So yes, currently our curriculum division is working on further guidance on this piece of legislation. And then wanted to include from earlier this week, TASB did release their policy updates. And so I kind of broke it up into two sections, what's going to be provided for this school year, the 21-22 school year, on these requirements. And so really looking at your district improvement plans to include a clear statement on dating violence is not tolerated. So really putting that in your district improvement plans, probably trickling down into your campus improvement plans. How does that, what does that mean? How, and then further guidance on that and what kind of training you will be providing. And then what are your procedures on reporting and immediately notifying a parent if a report identifies as a student as an alleged victim or perpetrator? So really think about, how do either students, educators report, and then how do you notify that parent that either their child is a perpetrator or has been a Okay, am I muted or unmuted?
You're back.
Oh, okay, yeah, no problem. All right, and so I think the last thing I was talking about was how do you procedures for reporting and immediate reporting that victim or that perpetrator, and then also notifying that parent. So you got to think about the two processes in that system, and then what are your guidelines for students who are victims? And so really thinking of their safety, what is the next situations, how do you handle that in a classroom, in a building, especially if they're in the same grade, same building, what is going on, and really thinking about that. So really also making available students age-appropriate educational materials on the dangers of dating violence and what are those resources for especially those who are seeking help. And so really thinking about those partners that you are working with in your districts on trafficking, dating violence, on child abuse. What is those materials? What are those resources that are you putting out? And really to be identified, and how are you vetting those materials? Really thinking about that, and then allowing parents to look at those dating violence and those materials and resources. So by December 2nd, which is coming up, you should have updated, so districts should have updated the materials in their district improvement plan to address these items. And make sure that you have provided the parental notifications required by SB 9. So really thinking those things are coming up. In the next policy update, which is update 119, they will be, TASB will provide their clarification on parental notification provisions. So TASB will be providing a new FFH local document on parental notification provisions. So that will be coming out, not sure what date, so that you can meet, but it will probably be before so that you can meet your December 2nd guidelines. I see there a template for the dating violence policy. Probably that will come out maybe with the 119 update from TASB, but we will take that question back and make sure. And then for this 2020, 22, 23 school year, you're right. So the rest of this, how do you, looking at SB 9 requirements in the local for your local boards to adopt that policy, establishing a process. So that one's going to come out a little bit later on the adoption of your curriculum materials on child abuse, family violence, and the dating violence and sex trafficking. So that will also come out in that 119 update. So recommendations for those policies will come out, but just know that's not effective until the 22-23 school year. And then they will also be looking at providing you updates and the notification and consent on those topics in the 2022 Model Student Handbook. So TASB will be doing a lot of that clarification and development of materials for you. And then when those come out, we will also make sure that you get that and make sure you know what those are. So those are a couple of updates from their shop. Our TEA and our curriculum division are looking at these guidelines and these procedures, and our work group is also looking at them. And so we will also work in hand to make sure that you have the materials that you need as we go into that.
Monica, I wanted to chime in here on the district improvement plan. So there's been some questions about how do districts update that addendum. It's a district decision how they handle their district improvement plan updates, but that it should be reflected by the December 2nd date. That was TASB guidance.
So yes, in the meantime, did go with the board policy update 118 on the dating violence. So yes, because it's uniform, it's clear. You can always go above what's out there because you know that's basically the standard. But if you want to go beyond for your district, knowing that you can do that. So we catch all questions.
And so as we move on, sorry, Monica. No, I was just going to say, you know, a lot of the way that bill in particular and some others has to do a lot with your local school board's implementation of some of those provisions. And so, you know, we can get a certain level of guidance from TEA and others, but to some extent, it's going to be locally driven how you implement some of these things. And I saw some questions in the chat about existing practices around this and the parents' right to access these materials. You know, you may have already gone through some of these processes with your SHAC to approve certain materials and already implement certain curriculum. Somebody asked about proprietary curriculum materials, and the way that the bill is written is actually provides various opportunities to give parents that right to review. So one, if it was open source material, you could just make that available online through a web link. But if it is purchased or it's proprietary, you could have, and I know of a district that's doing this already, they have a parent's right to review during school hours. Is what's written into the bill, that you can actually come up to the campus and review the material. So they have a watermarked version of their curriculum on campus that parents can come and access. Otherwise, for those proprietary materials, what the bill says is that you could come up with a cost scheme, the vendor, to give parents a right to purchase those lessons. You know, I don't imagine many people are going to want to take that route. So it may be that it's easier to just provide that review on campus, but that is another way to deal with that proprietary issue as it's addressed in the statute. We're running a little behind on time, so I just want to wrap up. These last couple of legislative updates don't deal with trafficking specifically, but may be of interest to you all in relation, sort of ancillary to the issue. The first two have to do with some reforms that were made around the definition of child abuse and neglect in the state of Texas and mandatory reporters. And so this shouldn't impact you too much in your current practice, but it's something to be aware of. The first one was House Bill 567, which took a number of steps to try to protect parents from basically too much investigation. We don't want children being removed from their homes unless that's absolutely necessary. And basically what that bill did was sort of bolster the definition of neglect that's currently being used in the state of Texas. So whereas prior to this, you just had to show that a child had been exposed to substantial risk, now that child has to be exposed to an immediate danger as a result of that neglect. And that neglect has to show blatant disregard for the consequences of their actions. And so in theory, there will be likely less children that are at this level of neglect, but that is not necessarily a question that you have to figure out as a reporter, because related to that, the second issue for mandatory reporters is a small shift from just having a cause for concern that a child has been abused or neglected to having a reasonable cause for concern. And my guess, just my own personal opinion, is that you all probably are reasonable. So if you have a cause for concern, it probably is a reasonable one. So I wouldn't want you to overthink these requirements, but just know there may be some difference in terms of things that may have been reported in the past to DFPS that led to an investigation and removal of a child compared to now. But again, our role as mandatory reporters is not necessarily investigating all the details, but just knowing whether or not something rises to a level of concern to report. And those folks at statewide intake and DFPS can make that call and filter things out, but it is something to be aware of. And then the last slide on legislative updates, these are, again, a little bit further removed, but I think they touch on related areas. We won't go into detail on all of them. The first one, Representative Parker, has to do with guidelines around digital devices. And I include this just because we know that online safety is such a big issue with respect to trafficking and exploitation. The number of children that are exposed to harmful content online and are even recruited and groomed via digital devices is growing and growing. It's probably the most emerging threat that we have with respect to trafficking. So any effort to improve safety around digital devices is important. The second one, I know TEA has put out some prior information on, and that has to do with providing districts with identification kits, basically to identify missing children. I include just because, again, when you look at risk factors for trafficking, missing and runaway children are a population that are particularly vulnerable to potential exploitation. You may have seen information around including suicide prevention information on ID cards. Again, that seems a little disconnected from trafficking, but I include that just because you may not know the level of trauma that survivors of trafficking face. There has been some really interesting research done on health consequences of trafficking for survivors. There's a study that's a bit dated now that did a pretty large survey of survivors to identify health consequences. Over 40% of those survivors indicated at least one suicide attempt after their trafficking situation, and over half had diagnosable PTSD symptoms. And so I think it's important not to overlook. We sadly have had service providers who have lost youth in their care to this issue. And so I think it is a related topic that's worth being aware of. And finally, there have been some updates under Senate Bill 1267 to look at and streamline what continuing education looks like for educators, recognizing there's so much out there. The final version of this actually did not remove or take away from they recognized that child abuse and trafficking training needed to continue, but the way that some of this is administered and the guidance may change broadly around CE. So I just wanted to flag that. And Monica, I don't know if you wanted to provide any additional context on any of these as far as agency guidance goes.
So I do want to talk a little bit about those identification kits. There is someone for all of our LEAs that are out there at your Education Service Center. the regional center that will be able to order those kits for you if you have not already ordered or you have parents that are interested. So feel free to really reach out to ask about those kits. I know within the, kids are coming up missing every day. And so really this will help a parent to help their child to at least to hopefully find them in a timely manner. And then on the last one, as Todd said, 1267 was the report, training and those requirements. Those 3 lines will be coming out in June from our educative services certification and licensing division. So really what that will be coming out, and we'll reference you to those as we go into that. All right, so that kind of leads us into our school-based requirements and our refreshers.
Yeah, and I know we're running a little bit behind, so we can probably hustle these because these are all basically reminders about different levels within a district, but just refreshers of what is required and hopefully some resources and consideration as you attempt to meet those.
So yeah, so this one is really talking about for your school board members and your superintendents and their requirements, and then where can you find those policies. So just know that there are some requirements for them. It's not as you go into your practices. And so this one is on your staff and knowing that those open enrollment at the beginning of the year and making sure that everyone has been trained. So really thinking about that recognition, that reporting, and who is reporting and how the training has been received. How are you documenting? Really think about how you document it. And your parent awareness, really what are you getting that information out to parents to make sure that they are aware of the issues related to abuse and trafficking, and really getting them as partners into the work that we're doing here. So really think about what are you doing there. And so the next one is what research programs are you using? Really thinking about those programs in your area, really that help prevent abuse and trafficking. And then, sometimes thinking about, do you need to reevaluate? Is it time to change? Or are they doing a great job? And so, what are your mentors? And so, thinking about their areas of expertise, and then how do they include the TEKS? Then some of our resources that are out there. Last Thursday on the 28th, a new to the administrator address letter went out on human trafficking prevention and awareness and our reporting reminders. So that is out there for you. The link is here also. And then we have our child abuse toolkit that was developed went out at the beginning of last year, really talking about how to recognize, how to online in both venues of a face-to-face realm or in your virtual education system. So really looking at that. And then a great resource and a tool, it is the Human Trafficking in American Schools. It has a plethora of information that you can use that is provided by our United States Department of Education. So really thinking about what can you use there. That's where I get a lot of my other outside information that as we go into this. The thinking about our partners, those that you're using for your training and your prevention awareness activities. You have your education service centers. We have our children's advocacy centers. We also have the Gateway module, realizing that the Gateway module, if you're using it for child abuse and human trafficking, it only covers the human trafficking portion. You will have to add on a child abuse piece. Protect Texas, your Unbound Keeping Students Safe, Love 146, and then NCMEC, our National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And also, I think we also mentioned earlier, Crime Stoppers also provides training. So there's a certain plethora of organizations out there that do training and do prevention awareness sessions. So really look at what is your options. Reach out to your ESCs. They will give you those options. Reach out to Region 14's Title IV page, because I know they got a lot of information there that you can use to find that. So wanted to remind you that we do, to meet that that reporting for students, we have the child abuse posters out there, No Go Tell student posters. So really take an opportunity. They are downloadable. You can get them printed in your own shops. They are the right size, 11 by 17. But when you post them, make sure that they're eye level for our students. Think about a kindergartner in those small schools, just small campuses. Think about your high schoolers. Thinking about where you're placing those, where are you putting them in the hallways, the gyms, student facing, and it is available in English and in Spanish. And on mandatory reporting. Remember, we first report out to DFPS, but also if it's an emergency, call 911. If it's an emergency, don't wait, don't hurry. So we're also asking that with the issue of human trafficking, that you report to DFPS and your local law or your state law enforcement departments. So call DFPS and your law enforcement. So child abuse, we're making our reporting to DFPS. We're starting there. If you really think there's something, a child life is in danger, you're gonna call 911. With the incidents of human trafficking, you're calling DFPS and your local law enforcement. So just remember, that's the little nuance that we have at this point with that. Wanted to highlight and want to say thank you for joining us today for this, our kickoff for the year on our human trafficking webinar series as we go into that. But if you want to catch any from last year, they're all posted on our student populations division webinars and trainings. Or you can go to TA YouTube page and find our playlist there. So you'll see those two links there. So, and then I won't say today, but possibly next week, you will find today's recording there. And then as we go into our series for the year, you will see the topics as we go into this, and then really looking at the different things. So hopefully you will be able to join us again for our next session as we get into this, and that will be December 3rd. These are two questions. I think we caught some of them. If we did not, we will definitely get back with them. But any questions, Nancy, that you think we have not answered or catch up on?
No, I think we're good. Unless I accidentally missed them.
While we're watching that to see if anything else comes in, I just want to thank everybody for being on this call and, going above and beyond. Just a gentle reminder, that the things we're talking about, they're legislative and policy requirements, right? They're sort of a minimum requirement. I know that so many of you are going above and beyond just what statute and policy requires. And so I encourage you to consider thinking about what are even best practices above and beyond some of these things. You truly are front lines and helping to not only identify students, there's a misconception that kids who are trafficked are not coming to school, but they may very well be in your classroom. But even more likely, your ability to be that safe person, that's a protective factor that prevented that exploitation in the first place. And so there are a lot of unique and innovative things happening around the state, even to empower students themselves to be the voice of change and to take action around this issue. And just continue to consider those things. If our team can be of any help as you do that, let us know. I did also want to mention that if you just are a total policy nerd and interested in other human trafficking updates that aren't necessarily school related, I gave a webinar on that a few months ago that went into a lot of other issues related to trafficking from this session. And you can find that on our website. and the link I think is provided at the end of this with our contact information. But our website also has a lot of resources, including that archived webinar with other legislative updates.
Right. Thanks, Todd. So here's our contact information. Then I will flip it back to the evaluation link QR code for you. But I want to say thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being attentive for your questions. If there's something we missed, we will catch it and either address it in our next one or send out a little note. So thank you.
Oh, I did see come in
ahead,
that I don't. Somebody asked if the Be the One posters from the Office of the Attorney General are required to be posted. And I'm not sure if they mean in school specifically or just anywhere, but that slide that I showed earlier with establishments that have to post human trafficking signage, those are really the only ones that have mandated signage requirements. And currently, the way that's implemented is a little messy because depending on the location, there's a different agency that oversees it. So for example, bars are regulated by TABC, so TABC has model signage and requirements for bars. Massage schools and hair salons are overseen by the State Department of Licensing and Regulation, so they have a signage requirement. The only one I can think of that is OAG specific is they had to create the rules for sexually oriented businesses. So SOBs have to use the AG sign for trafficking. But one thing that new law did is tried to streamline those. So the Attorney General's office will be coming up with sort of a new model sign. And if each of those agencies approves, people can use that one sign instead of having this sign in the ER and this sign in a transportation center and this sign in a massage school. There is potential for that to be more streamlined, but currently, no, nobody is using just the Be the One sign. So it could be a resource that you use even without a requirement. That was the only other one.
So I think marvelous. I think Nancy has dropped the link or will be dropping the link or will be providing it follow up with the email. So thank you for joining us today and have a great weekend. Remember, turn your clocks back.